Welcome everybody to the highlight of the Liberal Democrat Conference, and I say that as somebody who barely scraped an O-level history. And thank you very much for coming to a fringe meeting. We were speculating as the panel was getting ready what the attendance would have been like if we'd offered sandwiches this time round. But you are just here for food for the mind. This we know. Thank you very much. We are going to have a cracking session. The way this is going to work, our two eminent panelists are going to speak. Duncan is then going to do a plug for the history group. And all the while, you can be submitting your questions into the Q&A, not the chat. The chat is where you just behave as you would in a normal fringe meeting, isn't it? No, put your questions in the chat, and because we're constrained by time, we'll be trying to pack as many of those questions in as we possibly can. Okay, the topic and the theme: back from the dead, the Liberal Party in the 1950s, stroke 60s, stroke 70s, but 1950s. And we've got two people who are eminently qualified to talk about that. So our first speaker is Mark Egan. Mark, who did his thesis on the grassroots organisation of the Liberal Party from 1945 to 1964, something that he wrote in 2001. He's a long-standing member of the history group. He was a clerk in the House of Commons for a long time, but get this, he is now the Greffier of the States of Jersey. I mean, I don't know what the pay's like, but the title alone makes it worth it. So, Mark, you are extremely welcome. Floor is yours for about 15 minutes or so. Go.
Thanks, Liz. Great pronunciation, by the way, of Greffier.
Well, some of us are fluent in Norman French, mate. There you go.
It's a small minority, Well, I'm really delighted to have this opportunity. I've not been to a Lib Dem conference for 25 years, although it does feel a bit different to the last time I went. So on the topic then of back from the dead, I just wanted to start by reflecting on how much of a revival there was. We tend to talk about the revival in terms of the early 60s, and through this talk, I'm going to talk about the several revivals that took place during the 45 to 64 period. But I'm going to start by comparing 1964 and 1945, and also looking at what happened after 1964, because in some respects it wasn't that much of a revival, and the party still looked a bit corpse-like in the late 1960s. Starting off with the period 1964, looking back to 1945. It's worth remembering the Liberal share of the vote in 1964 was only 18.5% where candidates stood on average, which was less than in 1945. Although there were more Liberals standing in 1964, which will have made a difference. The number of Liberal MPs elected in 1964, 9, was the same as in 1945. The number of Liberal associations that were in existence and affiliated to the National Party, it had reached 478 in 1962, but that still left 150 constituencies around the country without a Liberal association. So that's a little bit of context, not to get too carried away, I suppose, by the scale of the revival. It's also worth looking at what happened after 1964. The party really struggled in the later 60s. Opinion polls, well, if I start with some by-elections, for example, in the general election in 1966, the party went backwards slightly. Third place finish in 1966 in Carmarthen by-election would have been very disappointing. And then after that, a series of third and even fourth place finishes in by-elections where the party looked pretty weak. Looking at opinion polls very briefly, by and large, between 1945 and 1950, the Liberals bounced between 8 and 14%. 14% seemed quite often to be a top limit for the party. And if you look after 1964, in fact, there were no poll showed party support over 14% from October 1963 through to August 1969. And indeed, then again, that was one poll over 14% in August 1969, and we didn't beat 14% again until November 1972. So that's a bit of context. When we talk about revival and back from the dead, I think it's important not to get too carried away. But there were revivals, and it's pretty necessary because the party was in dire straits after 1945, and particularly in the early 1950s. But I just want to firstly challenge the idea that there was one revival. There were essentially three. There was an immediate post-war revival in the late 1940s. This was something which party headquarters wanted to engineer. They put a lot of money and effort into trying to set up organizations in different parts of the country. And that led on to the experience in the 1950 election, where there was a big increase in the number of candidates, and as is well known, an enormous number of lost deposits. But I think one thing that's important about that post-war revival, it was particularly strong in universities, particularly the older universities, where the party's membership was on a par with the other two parties, and that is significant. Later, the elections in 1950, 1951, very disappointing, to say the least. In the mid-50s, there was evidence of revival, and that was primarily through experience of by-election. So the one that seemed to really catch people by surprise and kickstart a degree of revival was the Inverness By-Election in 1954, where John Bannerman polled 36% and finished second. And after that, there were a series of not bad by-election performances. A couple of second places, Hereford and Rochdale, some decent thirds where the party managed to get over 20% of the poll, and of course the win in Torrington. It's worth pointing out in some of these places there were special factors at play. Torrington had been a national Liberal seat for a long period, and it was clear that there was a reunification of Liberal thought under the official Liberal Party around that time. But nevertheless, those by-elections were, I think, things that gave hope, where hope hadn't existed before, and it was reflected in some of the national opinion polling, where that 14% barrier was broken on a number of occasions in the mid to late 50s. And then, of course, there's the revival that we will know about, the one that took place after 1959, the Joe Grimond revival, particularly focused around the Orpington by-election in 1962, which was a tremendous result, and to a large extent quite a surprise to the party. It was the culmination of a number of really strong by-election performances. So looking at these different types of revival, what were the features of those revivals? I think in all the three cases, they were grassroots revivals. So I mentioned firstly in the 40s that the party leadership, the party organisation, had sought to set up new Liberal Party organisations in different constituencies. But that's not really where the action was in terms of that period of revival. It was the universities, and it rather caught the National Party by surprise. There were seats at that point on the Liberal Party Council reserved for universities, and all of a sudden these new people were turning up and telling them that business was booming at the Liberal clubs and the universities, and it wasn't something that the National Party particularly inspired or understood. Similarly with the by-elections, the idea of going around the country to campaign in by-elections seems, from my research, to have emerged spontaneously, probably through university clubs, again, organising what were often called commando raids, jumping on buses, hiring buses to go to places. Hereford seems to have been, the 1956 Hereford by-election seems to have been one of the first occasions where that activity took place, and it became a thing that Liberal activists did, but not something which was necessarily inspired at the start by the Liberal Party leadership, which regarded by-elections as a purely local matter and not necessarily something that they would get involved in. It took quite a long time before the party leadership realised the potential for by-elections to catalyse support for the party and to get some enthusiasm and some momentum going. Local council activity, fighting and winning local council awards was something that began to emerge in the mid-50s in disparate parts of the country. Rugby, Southend, Liverpool, quite famously, Finchley. Again, this was not something which was inspired by the national leadership. It was something that was done at local level by local activists who wanted to be elected and found new tactical ways of getting themselves heard and becoming successful. one of the issues around that grassroots revival was the disparate nature of it. It was very patchy from one place to another, and although in some places it could be very successful, in others it tended to encourage cranks, if you like, to take over certain local associations, and sometimes to do damage to the Liberal Party brand. And we see that quite a lot in the late 50s and early 60s, where the national and federation parties struggled to control some of the individuals who had taken control of local associations. A second feature, I think, of these revivals, which is perhaps obvious from what I started off with, is that they were hard to sustain. The party was able to make some progress at by-elections to win.
Mark, you've knocked your...
It said I've been muted by a moderator. I don't know whether I've
Okay.
fired
You're back in. You're back in.
Excellent. All right. So I was just saying that one of the features of the revivals was that they were hard to sustain. Progress could be made to an extent, but the party found it really hard to sustain that. So it could win one by-election, but then not a second. That was famously a problem with the Orpington by-election result. It could make some progress in opinion polling, but then slip back again. But I think it's important to note that all the time during these periods of revival, the party accumulated new recruits and new activists who, by and large, in many cases, stayed. So the party of 1964 looked very different from the party 20 years earlier. The membership looked very different. There were fewer landed gentry on the Liberal Party Council, more ordinary people, I suppose you would say. And there were more, the local council makeup, for example, was much more familiar, I think, with the Liberal Democrat councillors of years, decades to come, than with the sort of aldermen and all guards who were there in the 1940s. I think a third feature is the importance of the leadership of the party, particularly Joe Grimmond. I think it's undoubtedly the case that Joe Grimmond was a major inspiration for the Liberal revival, both to an extent in the mid-50s, although that revival actually began before he became leader, and certainly in the period after 1959. And his ability to inspire and to motivate Liberal Party activists was crucial. And I think a fourth thing I would mention is the importance of ideas. Probably if you look back to the party in the late 40s, and you asked people why they were in the Liberal Party, they would talk about free trade, first and foremost, as a concept, almost as a religious totem, and the fact that the party was not the Labour Party. But later on, particularly again with the influence of Joe Grimmond, there became more modern, more up-to-date, more tangible ideas, particularly around British membership of the common market, now sadly not a feature of political life, and opposition to the UK's own independent nuclear deterrent. And those from the research I've done, those ideas and Joe Grimmond's leadership together were a major inspiration for activists joining the party, both to inspire that revival in the early 60s and to sustain the party beyond that. There were undoubtedly a number of limitations and missed opportunities with these revivals. Many of them will be totally familiar to anybody listening here. Turning local council success into parliamentary success was extremely elusive. The party didn't know how to do it and struggled to find any kind of method of doing it in the early 60s. The party became highly dependent on big moments, the big by-election that they had to win. And of course, that was particularly the case after Orpington. A huge amount of effort was put in to win in by-elections after the Orpington election, but they just couldn't do it. And it's notable that by 1964, the Liberal share of the vote is slipping down and down. And indeed, in some by-elections by 1964, the party was polling worse than it was polled in 1959. The problem, which is, again, very familiar, general elections were a binary choice between two parties who could form a government. And as elections approached, it's noticeable in 1959 and 1964, the Liberal Party slid and there was no effective strategy to stop it. One of the consequences of the pattern of revival was there were huge fluctuations in membership, in where we have figures in membership of local liberal associations. They could fluctuate to enormous extents, from single figures to 3 figures, back down to single figures in the space of 1 year to the next, dependent on motivation and enthusiasm of people involved in those organisations at the time. And the figures as well show the same thing around votes. The party's ability to hold on to votes from one election to the next was limited. So there was lots of positive sentiment for the Liberal Party, and survey after survey showed that. Lots of people were willing to think positively about the party and perhaps support it, but very difficult to turn that into success. And the number of people who were firm supporters of the party was small, although growing during this period. So why do we still talk about the 60s revival, the Orpington era? We don't talk so much, I think, about the, to some extent, more significant revival in the early 70s, or even perhaps in the early 90s. And I think it is the figure of Joe Gremmond and the nexus of charisma, ideas, the inspiration he provided to a generation, really, which still brings us back to this period, and which still brings a significance to this subject 60 years on. So for me, I wonder, is the lesson of revival really about the importance of marrying charismatic, inspirational, ideological almost leadership with grassroots enthusiasm? Where there was grassroots enthusiasm without that leadership, as there was perhaps in the mid-40s and the early to mid-50s, it was very hard for that revival at a grassroots level to gain any kind of traction. But where you brought the two together, there was that opportunity for the party to make progress. So if there's a wish to look for lessons today in what happened in the 50s and the early 60s, that to me is the key lesson. The importance of bringing, the party cannot succeed without bringing those two factors together. And it's whether that's a hopeful lesson or not, I'll leave that to others to comment on. But that for me is what I would take away from this period in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was a really brilliant presentation. Just one thing I didn't, just didn't ring true. The idea that there would be local parties that would be overtaken by complete mavericks. I mean, who ever heard of such a thing? But basically, but no, thank you. Brilliant. Some really set off some thoughts running. Our next speaker completed his PhD thesis in 1966, Cornell University, on the Liberal Revival 1955 to 66. He then became a Liberal Party press officer. He stood for Parliament 5 times, latterly in Saltaire, I do believe, Shipley. He was the leader's speechwriter and has served more time on party policy committees than is fair, really, in a lifetime. And for all of that, something that you might not know, that earlier on this week, William was 80 years old. It was his 80th birthday. He's been my hero for a very, very long time. As one of them grassroots and one of the people who was standing in them seats, William, over to you for 15 minutes.
Well, thank you. Well, one of the things which is, I've just been rereading my thesis since a very long time since I wrote it. And one of the things I realize has changed in my understanding of politics is that when I was a graduate student, the idea that there were people around who might possibly have been involved in politics for something like 50 years seemed incredible. Now that I'm 80 and have been a member of the Liberal Party for 62 years, I understand that the historical continuity keeps us all going. And part of the Liberal revivals has been all the way through that each revival attracts new recruits, but also re-energizes old faithful Liberals. And that has happened every time. I would disagree a little with Mark on the number of revivals. I don't think the Inverness By-Election was one. The Liberal Party between 1951 and 1955 got as close to dying as one could. With the single exception of the Inverness by-election, we were down to 250 elected councillors across the country. And those were the days when the number of councillors in urban district councils, rural district councils, boroughs and counties went into around 50 to 60,000. So we were very thin by then. But after 1955, things began to revive, and that was a mixture of items. Joe was a really important part of this. And it was above all that he inspired people, and he certainly inspired students like me. And I had some of the people that I knew as undergraduates have stuck around in the party ever since. And when I came back from America after 3 years and found myself at Oxford, I met various people in the Oxford University Liberal Club, including its then president, Helen Rushworth. And I'm still in touch with many of those who have stayed around in the party ever since. So everything Mark says about the importance of university clubs and young liberal meetings in the 50s and 60s is absolutely right. Although it's also true that as we revived, we kept finding people who had been liberal for an amazingly long time. Before we started, I was chatting to Liz about the Reverend Barker, and I have a wonderful memory when I was candidate in Shipley of a young student called Liz Barker asking if we could go to Saltaire Methodist Church, and discovering that the Reverend Barker had indeed been minister there, and having the lay minister preach a sermon which came as close to saying why all Methodists should vote Liberal as one could possibly expect. That was very much part of the tradition, particularly across the north of England. But I also remember a wonderful man called John Nicholson, who turned up when I was fighting Moss Side in 1974, who had fought as a candidate in 1945, had worked in the 1935 election, thought about going into politics, and had become instead a Baptist minister. I took his 15-year-old son out canvassing then, and he afterwards blamed me for converting Chris to liberalism, and Chris Nicholson was chair of Kingston Council way before he was 30. John Nicholson turned up again and again every time that I fought a different seat. And when I last saw him was the president of Leeds Northwest. There were people like that with a remarkably long period of service in the party. I see from my thesis that at the Young Liberal National Dinner in 1966, Leonard Behrens reminisced about when he had joined the Young Liberals in 1910. So all of these revivals brought people back as well as new people in. I think a second dimension of Joe's approach to the party, however, was he did take the organization into account, and he knew how to find good people to do it. Frank Byers was tremendous. Mark Bonham Carter knew how to organize things. And an organization which had almost completely disappeared at the national level between 1951 and 55 became really remarkably effective given the shortage of money by the time of the Orpington by-election. And the strength of the 1961 to 64 revival was partly that places in the suburbs where we had not been strong before had learned how to organize. The Orpington Local Association had well over 1,000 members long before the by-election started. And the organizational department was learning how to manage by-elections on a much more effective basis, and also beginning to grip the question of how do you make sure that your candidates are not too maverick. So I think the Grimmond revival, as I think it's fair to call it, set us up for the next revivals to come. although just again to remark in mild criticism of what Mark had said, that the revival of the early 1970s, with those by-elections in 1973, which carried us a very long way, occurred in spite of the fact that Jeremy Thorpe was our leader, and a great many of us couldn't stand our leader. But that was, as with a lot of other things, partly a result of disaffection with the major parties. And the last thing I would say before we open it to discussion is that all of these revivals show how painfully, in a two-party system with our electoral system, the fortunes of a third party depend upon what happens for the two major parties. The attempted post-war revival after 1945 ran into the ground on the sharp conflict between the Conservatives and the Labour government. What happened after 1956 in particular was that Suez triggered a sense that the Conservative Party was actually the old reactionary Conservatives and not the one nation Conservatives that Churchill had been trying to present it as since 1951. And then after 1958-59, the sense that Labour couldn't win, that Labour must lose, as a book put it, also gave us added credibility. And that's what helped us up from 1960 to 61, 62, 63, when we won all those council seats and then eventually some by-elections. And what ended that revival was the recovery of the Labour Party, the recovery first in terms of cohesion and then in terms of electoral support, and then, of course, winning the 64 election, which demonstrated that we could not present ourselves as the radical alternative to the Conservatives, but that Labour was still that. So in all of these revivals, and the legacy of the Grimond revival in terms of a new generation of liberals, which has kept us going through them, is tremendous. But we still have to remember that the barriers to a third party breaking through are enormous. They were enormous then, and they're even greater now because professional organization and money counts even more now than it did then. Happily, in those days, politics was much more amateur. You needed much less money to be able to make an effect. And as my last little story before I go, I well remember the extent to which we transformed politics from the Highland constituency by putting up some money to buy a minivan for the organizer. And that radically revolutionized the ability to communicate in a Highland constituency, which we won in the following election. That was the level of low organization which we were then at. Over to the discussion.
Thank you very much, both of you. And thank you for the questions that are starting to come in via the Q&A, but please keep them coming. Duncan, over to you for a plug.
Thanks very much, Liz. Thank you also to William and Mark. I just want to introduce those of you who aren't so familiar with the Liberal Democrat History Group to what we do. We were set up when this party was founded back in 1988 to promote the discussion and research of the history of the party and its predecessor parties, obviously the Liberal Party and the SDP. And we do this in four main ways. The first way is to organise meetings like this at Liberal Democrat conferences and also in between conferences. It used to be in London, obviously now they're online. And I can tell you that the next meeting we're organising in July will be looking at liberalism in the United States, which seems apt given the election of Joe Biden at the end of last year. And then we'll have another meeting at the autumn conference, whether that's online or in person. We publish the Journal of Liberal History. This is the latest issue. It's a quarterly, contains articles about aspects of liberal history, biographies of famous liberals, reports by meetings, book reviews, and other material. You can subscribe to that for just £25 a year or £15 unwaged. We also publish a range of booklets and books to go into a bit more detail on liberal history. So I'll just give you an example of this one, a really concise introduction to all aspects of liberal history. And we have booklets on liberal thought and liberal ideology and liberal thinkers and more broad overviews of party history and party leaders. And you can see all of that on our website, which is the fourth thing we do, and that also contains basic information about the history of the party. If anyone wants to visit our shop, online shop on the website, for the duration of the conference and for a few days afterwards, we're offering a 10% discount off everything we do. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the meeting. I hope you look at our website. Send us an email if you'd like to know anything more about us. And we're also on the exhibition stand in the exhibition for the rest of the conference. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Duncan. Looking at the questions in the Q&A, lots of questions about what was it about Joe Grimond that was so different, so special. I know the word that you've both bandied about quite a lot is charisma, but I want to put that to you as a question. When I look back and the times that I can remember, the 70s, 80s, 90s, when we have been at our height, I suppose, the height of our powers, is when we've had a combination of not just a charismatic leader, but key issues that we have been able to pick up and run with, which other parties have not, and tied that together with local organisation. And I wonder whether you think, looking back over the period that you're looking about, that was what was beginning in those revivals that we're talking about, Mark.
Yeah, so during my research, I interviewed over 140 people who were members of the Liberal Party before 1964, so I got quite a good flavour of what people thought. And one of the things I asked people was about different issues and about their views on party leadership. So what did Grimond offer? I mean, firstly, you have to look back to the period before Joe Grimond. Clement Davis was not a powerful leader of the Liberal Party. He didn't have a great, he was an old and probably ill man, really, in the early 50s. He'd rather given up, I think, to some extent. And he was not somebody who would have been well known, I think, to the British public, or certainly not somebody who said anything particularly memorable. He wouldn't have struck anybody as he was a man from a previous era. Grimond when he was elected, he was in his 40s as party leader. He was a good television performer, a good speaker. He had a good pithy sort of turn of phrase. And I think the point about ideas is really well made, because the Liberal Party was short of new ideas when he was first elected. The last sort of new thing that the party had sort of promoted was the idea of the co-ownership of industry. And that was something from the late 1940s as an alternative, really, to nationalisation of industry. There was nothing much after that until Grimond, and he floated. He really acted as his own think tank a lot of the time. He promoted ideas around British membership of the common market and the opposition to UK nuclear deterrent, UK having its own nuclear deterrent, which captured the imagination, and they were different to what the other parties were talking about. And William's quite right that the Suez Crisis was also a catalyst, because it drove many people who were comfortable with the Conservative Party away from it, and they found with Joe Grimond a comfortable home. And finally, Grimond also set off a whole range of independent sort of policy think tanks, experts, to look at different aspects of contemporary problems around local government, regional government, all sorts of other ideas. And that also helped attract people who wanted to be politically active, because they could find a home for their wish to kind of engage ideologically or theoretically in politics in the Liberal Party. It was a very fertile period for ideas at that time, which Grimond was directly responsible for.
William.
Yes, I agree. I mean, one of my earliest memories of Grimond was of him coming up to Cambridge when I was an undergraduate, sitting on the edge of a desk and just thoroughly enjoying talking to us and throwing ideas out at us. And that was, I think, the charisma. And he could captivate an audience. And I think that was what certainly I went up to university not knowing what my own political affiliation was, and I became a convinced liberal because I'd listened to Grimond on a number of occasions, and he sounded far more interesting and far more persuasive about the sort of society he wanted to develop. He produced 3 books between 1957 and 1961. And in an early one, he came out highly relevant to the current integrated review of foreign and security policy, in favor of joining the European Economic Community, in favor of withdrawing our armed forces from east of Suez, and against investing an awful lot of money in the nuclear deterrent. But he also has some really good domestic policies, very much in terms of modernization, education and training, investment in industry, and so on and so forth. And to stress what Mark has said, there were a range of academics, really good academics, who set up the Unservile State group, the New Orbits group as young men. Chris Layton worked for him, then Harry Cowie, and he had a really good group of people around him throwing out new policy ideas which commanded respect elsewhere. That was an important part of that. That wasn't there in the 1970s revival, and it wasn't there in the 1940s revival either, and that did make a difference.
That leads into a question from Christian Moon. Are our fortunes in some way impacted by Labour in power and its ability to attract or in opposition a youthful, idealistic support, or is there any evidence of that back in the time that you're looking at, Mark?
Well, the party historically struggled when Labour was in power. It benefited from a conservative government which was unpopular. That was the best sort of guarantor of a revival. So if you look at the 1955-59 government, the 59-64 government, and also the Heath government 70-74, these were all examples of Tories in power. After a couple of years, things started to go wrong, and the Liberal Party was able to pick up the votes of disaffected Conservatives, if you like, who weren't perhaps prepared to vote Labour but would give the Liberals a go. And if you looked at the period, for example, 64 to 70 with Labour in power, by and large, the Liberals struggled. There was the by-election in 1969 in Birmingham that the party won, but otherwise it seemed to be an uphill struggle. My impression, so that's in terms of so that's more about the vote and the popularity of the party as a whole, not necessarily the ideological side of things. I don't think Labour in power was a problem from the point of view of the Liberal Party being able to recruit activists and position itself, because it certainly did distinctively in the later 60s at that time. And also that theory that the party really needed to see a conservative government in order to make any progress was undermined a bit later on. I think if you look during the Blair years, for example, the party was able to make significant progress as the Liberal Democrats, despite the fact there was Labour in power. But certainly at that time, that was the prevalent thought.
Thank you, William.
Well, it's an interesting question I don't know the answer to. After 1966, we had a very active, lively, and imaginative young liberal movement. And Jeremy Thorpe hated it and mishandled it extremely badly. If we had had a leader who had known how to handle the young liberals better, I think we would have done much better in that period than we did.
Yeah.
Jeremy Thorpe was a leader who led with a small group of people around him, and the rest of us couldn't really get in. And I was one of the older young liberals at the time, and wanted to try to explain to him and his group how he should deal with these very bright characters. And there were lots of problems on them being strongly in favor of the Palestinians, for example, in their undertaking direct action, like digging up cricket pitches, which he just could not see. And I think that damaged us. we might otherwise have come through to 1970 better than we did, and thus the revival of 1973 would have been much stronger.
Yeah, one of the fun things that I've managed to do this year is to first of all go to celebrate the first ever lesbian and gay LGBT protest in this country, which was held in Highbury Fields, and it was a protest against the arrest of a young Liberal called Louis Eakes by the police, and it's an event which first of all has sparked some really interesting events from people who are interested in LGBT history, but also gave occasion to our great friends Michael Steed and Bernard Greaves to talk not just about that event, but about how towards the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, there was this whole explosion of youth culture in music, in fashion, in whatever, and the Young Liberals were perhaps the first ever popular youth political movement that was a part of that whole thing. So we've had a number of great meetings and discussions about that over the last 6 months. So I don't know whether anybody has managed to capture them on these Zoom meetings. I hope they have, because it's a history which happened a bit before my time, but is incredibly important, I think, to pass on to young people these days, and we're in danger of losing all of that. Question from Claire Tyler, really good question. To what extent do you think that the party's enduring problem, perhaps, is that people tend to associate us with, define us by what we're not? We're not the Labour Party, we're not Conservatives. Mark?
That's a good question. So I think obviously the binary nature of the electoral system was a real problem strategically for the party, and that was evident at all these general elections, during this period and beyond. That the choice and the resources that were surrounding elections through the media and all the rest of it were all focused on that choice between this person or that person as Prime Minister, leaving the Liberals in a difficult position. I suppose during this period, one of the things Joe Grimond did, and we haven't talked about, is he positioned the party as clearly on the left of British politics, a non-socialist alternative to Conservative, but clearly not equidistant, to use a later phrase, between the two, but an alternative that was not Conservative. And I think that was an important piece of branding. It very much chimed with the views of the vast majority of Liberal activists that I interviewed from that period. They very much regarded themselves as, and William can no doubt talk about this as one of them, as to the left of British politics, but not part of the Labour movement. And I think that positioning was clever and helpful, but it only took things so far, because it opens up another line of attack, if you like, for the Conservatives, who were able to try and portray Liberals as a sort of a way of allowing the Socialists into power. So I think that the Liberal Party's always had that problem of being trapped into that kind of discussion, that dialogue about how they related to the other parties, and the classic questions about who would you support in a hung parliament and all the rest of it, that used to trap Liberal leaders at successive elections, because there wasn't really a good answer to it. And I suppose Liberal leaders and Liberal politicians did try to define the party in other terms, in terms of policy, but ultimately the conversation kept always being dragged back to, when you're in the House of Commons for the first time after the election, who will you be supporting? And which government will you back? And that was simply an intractable problem at national level.
Thank you, William.
Yep. I think it's different now from where we were then. British politics in the 1950s and 60s were very much class-based, and the large majority of people voted for the same party in each election, because they saw themselves as working class or middle class. That's no longer the case. What we now have is a largely alienated and disillusioned electorate looking for the party which they dislike least. And what we've seen in other European countries is that the old two-party systems, or the old party systems as such, have broken up because the electoral system allows that to do, and new parties are now emerging, be they Greens or D66 or whatever, as well as parties of the hard right and parties of the hard left. And we have a party system in which the Labour Party, for example, is now absolutely stuck between wanting to recapture a working class vote, which it thinks is very socially conservative, and trying to satisfy its middle class vote, which is socially radical. We, on the whole, have had that radical middle class vote, or quite a bit of it, and our problem has been, how do we get into the working class vote, which we had some of in the 1950s and have lost progressively ever since, because part of that was the old nonconformist vote, which has now disappeared. I don't think we are in the same situation as we were then, but we're even more in a situation when the electorate is voting from distaste for politics altogether. Trying to get across an appeal which is a much more positive one requires more of an effort, stronger leadership, and more coherent ideas in a media situation which is much more hostile to open debate than it was then.
One strand that I would take from this debate this evening is that we have always been a party which has been distinct and had distinct positions on international questions, but also has had at the same time a strong focus on localism. And I suppose to an extent, our fortunes have varied by having the extent to which we've had a leader who is capable of having an eye for the international dimension, together with an ability to build and maintain that local organisation. Do you think that's fair? And do you think there are lessons that are to be learnt across the decades that we're looking at? Mark?
I certainly think that's fair in terms of international, the international outlook. You could certainly say that of Clement Davis, Grimmond, Jeremy Thorpe, despite all of the negative aspects of his leadership, which I completely agree with William's analysis. The one thing he did have going for him was a principled stand on a range of international issues, which I think did tend to catch the eye. And I'd then jump forward to Paddy Ashdown, of course, and the Hong Kong passport. And that is a distinctive space for the party quite often. But it appeals to an important but smaller group.
Do you think it is still in these post-Brexit days?
I think it could be. Yeah, I think people are. I think there is something in the British character which goes back a very long time. That is kind of internationalist in outlook, and you see that in 19th century politics as well, and before that even. And I think there is space there, but whether it generates mass appeal, what it does is it gets the party in the media in a clear way. So at the moment, the struggle is when there's any sort of issue, whether it's COVID vaccinations or health reform or whatever it is, that the party's it's not likely to have a distinctive position particularly, but even if it does have a particularly distinctive position, the reporting will go to the two main parties. Whereas with some of these issues, that almost the other parties will often have nothing to say particularly. That radical distinctive voice can be heard much more clearly, and there are people to whom that will be attractive. And I can't remember the second part of the question.
Local organisation, but we'll come back to that maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, William.
Yes, I mean the international element in the 1950s, which kept the party going, was at least as much anti-colonialism as Europe. And we have to remember that Thorpe's reputation in the Conservative press was as Bomber Thorpe, because he was strongly opposed to us allowing for Rhodesian independence. So that the internationalism was extremely strong then. I think it's there now. It's a minority issue. The deep conservatism of the older working class is part of what has become the nationalist element, and that's why Labour is torn as to what it will say on anything European or international. But in terms of attracting activists and members, the international dimension remains very important. I think all the way through this, we've been good on international issues. We've been very good on social issues, abortion, LGBT, all of that. On economic issues, it's been much more difficult. After all, in the 1950s, the party nearly tore itself apart between the economic liberals who were free trade first and those like Joe who wanted to move towards a more active state in the economy. When Michael Steed and I went to spend a week working in the Orpington by-election, we stayed with a family called the Seldons. And Marjorie Selden was a very active liberal, and I suspect a nonconformist. Her husband, Arthur, a free trade liberal, had left the party and was working in something called the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is where some of those people went to. I'm not sure that we have managed at any point in any of these periods to develop a sufficiently clear economic set of alternatives to the other two parties to make ourselves distinctive. And that may remain a problem now.
Thank you. Let's come back to this issue of local organisation. Mark, very much from what you were saying, it was patchy, but our survival was very much based around local organisation in the 1950s and 60s. To a large extent, that is still the case. What can we learn from what happened back then to inform what we're doing now?
Well, the party really didn't know very much about its local organisations. If you listen to Michael Meadowcroft, he speaks and writes. He was recruited in the early 60s really to try and find out what was going on, and ended up going around the country finding all sorts of groups of liberal councillors or liberal activists or people who called themselves liberal councillors. And it was a discovery mission, really. And I think that brings home the point that when these revivals began, and I interviewed a lot of the people that began these revivals, and they began with a desire to win an award. The putting together of a leaflet, which would today, be regarded as a focus leaflet, not called that then. Concentration on local matters, often with no reference to the party at all on the leaflet, or very little. And real, pound on the pavement stuff. This was something that people came up with of their own volition. It wasn't something they'd been encouraged to do by party headquarters or anything like that. And they developed their own tactics and their own approaches. And then news of what had been successful spread through things like Liberal News, through Liberal assemblies, and then gradually became more commonly known during the 60s when the Association of Liberal Councillors was set up. So I think the positive in that is the party at grassroots level is the party, and it can generate its own revival to an extent if it has that. And so I go back to that point I made, that right combination of that enthusiasm at the local level with something to rally around at the national level. It doesn't. Not everything has to be sort of strategized from the top in order to be successful. The downside is, as I said, it's how you manage to harness that local energy and those ideas in a way which is sustainable and which can be transferred around the country and from one type of election to another. And that's where the Liberals struggled to transfer from one type of election, local council to county council to parliamentary elections, from one, the pattern of success Orpington is a good example. The by-election was won largely because the party had done so well at local level for so many years beforehand. But if you go to local authorities 5 miles down the road, there'll be no local Liberal councillors at all. So I don't know what the answer is to that. But if someone could find an answer to that and find a way of harnessing that energy and finds a way of being able to spread it around from one place to another, that would be one route to success. But it certainly eluded the party then.
William, thank you. William,
we're a much more coherent national party now than we were in the 50s, and my impression of the party in the mid to late 1950s was there were pockets of activity. Sometimes because a particular nonconformist church had kept things going very strong, or particularly set of family connections. Sometimes a local milliner or a local Liberal family in the southwest, and then you'd have these crazy activists who move in and start to get things going. Whom my father-in-law is a classic example, moving from Bradford to Leicestershire, not finding very much going on, setting work, and ending up leading the county council Liberal group, with the pleasure that he received from the Duke of Rutland having reluctantly to be polite to him every now and again, since he was leader of the Conservative group. But very much a sort of accidental pattern of activity across the country, depending on whether you had the Taylor family in Newcastle or whatever it was, spending a huge amount of time persuading others who might not have been so active to come and join them. We don't have the money that the Conservatives have to send out stuff from party headquarters, to have the local organisers that they've got. So we do depend on volunteers really prepared to push things hard. And that's part of why we're so much stronger in some parts of the country than others.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you for that. That has really been a fascinating look back and some inspiration for the future, I think. So Wendy Taylor asked a question about are there recordings of Joe Grimond? There certainly are recordings of Joe Grimond, and I'm absolutely certain that people in this room will know where to find them and the best of them. So can you all give that to Wendy Taylor so that she can march to the sound of gunfire for a bit more, I think, and that's the thing. I was so incensed watching the Tory Cabinet Office spokesperson in the Lords the other day defending the things which the Tories are now doing to rig election law for the future. It is an absolute scandal the way that they are going out to change voter registration, to change caps on election spending, both nationally and local seats. It's absolutely terrible. It incensed me so much that I did 3 focus rounds last weekend at the first opportunity, and I sincerely hope that, having been banned from going out and shoving things through letterboxes, you all get out there and do nothing but between now and the election day, because the fighting spirit goes on and has to live with us, particularly against this horribly authoritarian government and in the presence of a very weak, just spineless Labour Party. So thank you very much for telling us how people hung on in the past, and the struggle continues. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.